I'm gonna give us a 30-second warning or so.
There's some delay. I don't know what it is.
I'm just gonna give us a 30-second warning or so, and then we'll get started because it's a full agenda. So get your snack-a-lackas. Say one more funny joke to your friend, and then we'll get going here. You can't hear me? Hello, hello. Can you hear me now? Good. So this is your last 30 seconds to say a really great joke. Make sure that you hit that punchline because we have a quorum. So we're going to finish our stories and our good jokes, and then we're going to all right. Noting the hour in the presence of a quorum, I call the Acton-Boxborough Regional School Committee to order. Members of the public who wish to watch the meeting online may use ActonTV's YouTube channel found on the top of the agenda. This meeting is also being recorded and will be posted on ActonTV's website at actontv.org. Per tonight's agenda, we will not have time for separate public participation. We are immediately on to new important business. Recommendation to appoint Director of Finance and Operations. Peter, take it away.
All right, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to the budget workshop. Just due to the timing and business of the year, we have one business item for the school committee first, which is a recommendation that we're making to appoint Sheri Matthews as our next Director of Finance and Operations. Sheri's making her way up to the table, but while she does, I'll just do, a very, very high-level overview of her resume. Sheri has been the Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations for the Weston Public Schools since 2018. Where she has been responsible for everything from budget to audit and compliance, supervision of staff, including programs such as food service, business office, facilities, maintenance, capital planning, student activities, transportation, very similar to the role we have here. Before she was in Weston, she was the Director of Business Services for the Tewksbury Public Schools. Prior to that, Director of Finance and Operations in Leicester. And then prior to that, she was in a regional school district. She was the budget officer for Northborough, Southborough Public Schools. So we are very, very pleased that Sheri came forward as a candidate. She's exceptionally well qualified. All of her references were absolutely exemplary. Everyone she's ever worked with that I spoke to just sung her praises. I know she quickly arose out of our search team as an exceptional top candidate. So we're very pleased to present her to you tonight with the recommendation to appoint her as the Director of Finance and Operations effective July 1st.
Does anybody have any questions for Sheri?
Do we want to open it up to Sheri, maybe just say a few words? So Sheri, why don't you can introduce yourself and then you can warm up the crowd, sure. Essentially.
Sheri Matthews, I'm from Leominster, Mass, and you heard my resume, where I've been. I was actually in Region for 12 years, so that's kind of how I started out. Very happy to be here tonight, very excited about hopefully coming on in July and kind of getting my hands wrapped around the budget and getting back to the region. I really like the soup to nuts of regions and how you kind of handle everything, and I understand it's self-insured, so I'm all used to that too, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Thank you. As a Weston alum myself, I've heard nothing but outstanding things about yourself from classmates who now teach at the middle school. We'll just say that much. Thank you.
It's very nice, thank you. Well, thank you.
I move to appoint Sheri Matthews as our next finance director.
Seconded.
I didn't mean to steal your thunder, Liz. I apologize.
That was very aggressive. I promise we're not usually that aggressive. Wow. I have to give that to Adam and Ben. Liz, I'm so sorry. We'll get you in the next one. Okay, so that was Adam for the motion and Liz for the second. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? Very good. Welcome, Sheri.
Thank you very much.
We love it when the easy things are easy, y'all. Very good. Now on to ongoing business as we begin the end game of the budget work. This is our budget overview and presentation, the comprehensive one. It's been a long road coming. Thank you so much for the team for all of this work. Are you ready?
We are.
All right, very good. Let's get going.
All right, before we start our budget presentation, I do feel like I have to thank the Weston Public Schools. Because this is the third consecutive year where we're hiring one of the top administrators in the district to join Acton-Boxborough. So, you know, Midge, if you're listening, thank you. And sorry. But we are really thrilled that we've had a number of administrators join us in the last few years. So, Sheri, welcome.
Welcome, Sheri.
Budget workshop. So just to, set the table, what we've done in this agenda is we've actually built in a number of opportunities to pause and have questions, either from the committee or from members of the audience who join us, as just a way of helping the community understand the budget a little bit more, in addition to committee members who have already seen a number of presentations. The slides you see tonight, many of them are slides that you've already seen during the budget process. They may have been modified somewhat to reflect the current understanding of the financial landscape, but they're essentially fairly consistent as we've done through the process. We knew early on what the challenges would be with this budget, and so now it's just been making sure we follow the process to land a balanced budget. There we go. I just want to thank members of the select boards, finance committees, as well as any other citizens who are joining us in the audience tonight. Welcome. This is, it's technically the fourth presentation, but we snuck an early presentation in when we knew this was going to be a challenging budget. So even though it says presentation 4, this is actually the 5th presentation in the budget series. We are seeking a preliminary vote from the school committee tonight, which is consistent with the regional agreement. The regional agreement stipulates that we have to take a preliminary vote 25 days before the final budget deadline. The vote for tonight is a majority of the members from each town. So a majority of the members from Boxborough and a majority of the members from Acton is what's required to pass the preliminary budget vote. Next week is the budget hearing, or 2 weeks from now is the budget hearing. We then have the final school committee budget vote March 16th. That's different. That goes back to the traditional weighted school committee vote that we have. And then we have town meetings beginning in May. Just to talk a little bit about the context of where our students are at right now. We are, if you're just tuning in, about a 5,200 student district with about 800 employees, though this does not count a lot of our bus drivers, transportation personnel, some of our custodians, simply because of the way DESE reports out. It's just an odd function of that, and different data systems and things like that. But we are right now about almost 30% high needs population as a district, which is a change for us. We have about 11% of our population would be considered economically disadvantaged. About almost 5% would be considered English language learners, although we call them multi-language learners because we think it's an asset that students have, that they can come and speak multiple languages. And then we have just shy of 15% of our students would qualify as having a disability and receive services through an IEP. You will note in particular that the English language learner population is 91% higher than similar districts. That's a real change for us. Our operating costs per student is just about state average. We are considered average in terms of how we spend our money. I think the story of Acton-Boxborough isn't that we have the highest needs student populations. We know that there are gateway cities all around us that serve high needs populations of students every day at a much greater level than we have to. However, what I will say, the story for us is the change that we're undergoing, and it's a really rapid change in the students we're serving, and I think that there's a gap in understanding that is prevalent among our community and the faculty and staff that we have in our schools who serve students every day. In particular, we've talked a lot in the past about kind of changes in racial demographics of the community over the last 20 years, and some of the challenges and opportunities that's presented for us as a district as we try and be a more inclusive environment. But in particular, over the last several years, it's really the change in our multilingual learners that has been a lot of the story of our schools. You're going to hear more about that later tonight when Marie gets into it. But we've enrolled well over 100 multilingual learners just since the first day of school this year. That is a significant change for us in the demographics of our student population, and one that we're adjusting to. In addition, about 60% of our multilingual learners are actually coming in their first 2 years in the United States, which means they're coming in speaking little to no English. And so the faculty and staff have to be very, very well prepared and equipped to be able to welcome them into classrooms and continue to provide educational services. And that will be a theme that you hear through our presentation tonight. In addition, though, I think, not unlike some other communities around us, but maybe at a little faster rate than our surrounding towns, we're seeing a rise in students who might come from economically disadvantaged or low-income families. And we have had to really think about how we provide services for students and supports for families so that all of our students have full access to the educational services of the district. So wanted to just lay a little bit of student context for you before we dive into the budget numbers. In addition, I think, and this is a little bit more anecdotal, we're still looking at students who have, some lagging skills coming out of the pandemic. And certainly from a social emotional standpoint, if you, talk to any teacher who lives in this community, it probably wouldn't take more than about 15 seconds for them to talk about the needs of kids and how the needs of kids right now are exceeding the resources that they have in front of them and in their classrooms. And that, to an educator is probably the most frustrating and demoralizing thing when you have students in front of you and you're struggling to meet their needs. And so, I know our teachers are struggling with that. It's some of it's post-pandemic, some of it is just the changing demographics of our community and trying to, catch up to how we provide services for the evolving students we have. We've had to think a lot about increased mental health and behavioral health supports in our schools. We've talked a lot about the Cartwheel Care pilot that we did this year that's been tremendously successful so far in expediting mental health services to students in our district. That's going very, very well. We just kicked off our parent learning series, and we have several more workshops coming up in that. But that's one example of expanded access to mental health care. We have also done a lot around wraparound services for students and families so that, if students and families have needs that exceed what the schools might typically provide, we're able to connect them with an agency that can help them, with everything from rent support to, food, shelter, heat, things like that, those types of social services. And that's not something I think that has been a traditional need in Acton-Boxborough over the last 50 years. So certainly, again, I just want to keep coming back to it's about the changing demographics that we're undergoing and the need to shift how we provide resources and services to students in order to be responsive to those changing needs. And I will say it again, we have a critical need for English language acquisition support, and you'll hear that over and over again tonight. We have tried to focus on the idea of relationships, climate, and culture at the center of the strategy. I think the pandemic certainly provided a challenge to that as everyone was spread apart, and we're still seeing the shift back for students and trying to catch up on some of those social emotional learning skills. I'm not going to talk a lot about this tonight, but I just wanted to bring that visual back into everyone's mind. We had 3 major goals coming out of the pandemic, and I'm anticipating that our goals will be pretty much similar next year as well, so that we're not changing things every year on our educators, but really to think about the social, emotional, mental, and behavioral health outcomes for students. We want to think about kind of the impact of the pandemic on students' learning and how we can make sure that every student in our district is on a pathway to proficiency in both literacy and mathematics through our MTSS system. And then we really want to think about our students and families' sense of belonging within the schools and expand our work around culturally responsive practices. Those are our three main focus areas that we're working on as a district right now. School committee every fall adopts a series of budget guidelines. These are very much aligned with the district strategy, but I just want to go through these. So certainly the school committee was thinking about the impact of collective bargaining with the district's three major unions this year. We wanted to look at opportunities for organizational efficiency within the district to streamline operations. We wanted to really look hard at class sizes and make sure that to the degree resources are available, we can maintain appropriate class sizes at all levels of instruction. We wanted to make sure that students had access to a robust system of social, emotional, and academic supports in our schools. We wanted to make sure that we had a strong and inclusive school culture. We wanted to make sure that we were addressing places that we've discussed with you about disproportionate outcomes for students, and to the degree that it was economically feasible, we wanted to explore our continued path to tuition-free all-day kindergarten. So those were the major goals of the school committee that you established for the administration early on in the budget process. This, I want to give a lot of credit to Dave. This was Dave's top 10 list. But it's not good things. These are actually the top 10 challenges that we had. It was really a unique budget year in the confluence of different events that all came forward to present some really significant budget challenges. And I think it's important to talk about these a little bit. We were in a period of declining revenues or slowing increases from state and non-assessment sources. We are coping with the end of some of our grant funding for pandemic relief and the need to make decisions around whether or not to keep programs or to let them go. And for the extent we want to keep some services, we have to then fund them through the operating budget. We have, just like everyone's homes, we have historic inflationary pressures that have been placed on the district from everything to, supplies and materials, but also our utility bills are experiencing the same pressures everyone's are. We had an 8% increase in health insurance rates. The state operational services division approved up to a 14% increase in out-of-district special education tuitions and transportation services. There continues to be a disproportionate assessment increase coming from Minuteman to the town of Acton in particular. And it's not that they provide a tremendous educational opportunity. Part of that is the enrollment shift that's gone to Minuteman, and then their operating budget has continued to generally come in higher than what is sustainable for the community. We still have a need for critical infrastructure. We talked to you last meeting about that, and we'll come back to some of our infrastructure needs in the district and have to make sure we keep funding that. We had to plan for labor negotiations and the impact of that on the operating budget. We also are in a period of declining reserves as a district, and we had one of our two communities is already taxing at the maximum allowable limit under Massachusetts law, and so there was a need to limit the assessment increase that came from the committee to 3% in Acton. So that is a confluence of 10 challenges. In any year, one would be something that we had to really work through, but when you have 10, it provides a really difficult budget process for everyone involved. And so I thought it would be important to just talk about why did we get where we are with this budget and be very clear with that with community members. As I mentioned in the last bullet, we talked to the school committee early about what we anticipated to be a budget gap, and the school committee gave us guidance to target the Acton assessment at a 3% increase, and overall, the budget to go up about 2.5%. There are different levers that can take place during the budget process, why that number might change, but this was the early guidance we had in developing our budget. So from a historical standpoint of what went into this operating budget, we knew that in order to provide level services, in other words, do everything that we did this year, it was a 4.25% increase to what we spent last year, so that was about $107 million. We then looked hard at our grants and what was being funded through grants, and made some decisions around what do we have to continue, what can we let go. But there's about $1 million we had offloaded into ESSER or ARPA funding over the last several years to be able to continue to fund our schools at the level we wanted to. There was about $1 million there that had to come back into the budget. After the start of the school year, we had a number of students with identified needs that were unanticipated, either move in or become identified through special education processes that required one-to-one assistance in our specialized programs. We ended up having to add about $275, it's actually closer to $300,000 worth of classroom assistance after the budget process. We, as I already alluded to, have a critical need for English language acquisition support, and so we're planning to add 2 English language educators. It's the only addition to this year's operating budget that we're requesting. And so when that all adds up, that came to about $108.5 million, which was a 5.5% increase. The recommended budget, as it evolved, ended up being a little bit higher than the original school committee guidance of 2.5%. We're requesting a 2.7% increase, just because we were able to get the Acton assessment at a certain level and still go with that budget. That's still left about a $2.8, almost $3 million gap that had to be closed between what would provide level services and what we're proposing tonight. Just from a visual standpoint, we want to make sure everyone remembers this is not a one-year budget problem that the district is experiencing. The red on this bar graph represents the cost to the district of providing level services over the last 2 years. The yellow represents available revenue. So the red part of this bar, or the top of it, is really the gap that we've had in funding and what has needed to be reduced over a 2-year period. I'll say this again later, but last year's reductions and this year's reductions actually total 36 FTE over a 2-year period that the district has reduced. And we're getting to the point where if we continue doing that, we will not be providing the level of educational services that our community has come to expect. And we just have to be really clear about that.
May I just ask Peter to just expand upon what FTE means for those who may not know, and just slow down a little bit on that point? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So FTEs are full-time equivalent employees. So it's basically, you might have 2 half-time people that are no longer work with the district, but it equals 1 equivalent employee. So when we say 36 FTEs, it's the equivalent of 36 full-time employees, but that could be made up of multiple other people. So for example, last year we reduced a number of positions in classroom assistants. That was well more than the number of FTEs because they were all part-time individuals.
And so that's how much we've lost over these 2 budget years, 36.
Correct, the equivalent of 36 staff positions. Sure, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Marie to talk a little bit about enrollment and class size.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all. Peter, you'll drive, right? Thank you, because you're on the projector. So we have been in a period of declining enrollment. A lot of the declining enrollment happened in the previous years. These last 2 years have been relatively flat. We have a little over 5,000 students. And this year, we were down 53 students. The year before, we were down 54 students. But the 2 years before that, we were down 155 and 177 each. So we're down a total of 8% over the last 4 years. And the state is down on average 4% over the last 5 years, something like that. So if you go to the next slide, we work with NESDEC. NESDEC does our projections, and we've been following and comparing year after year after year. For whatever reason, I focus a lot on the incoming kindergarten class because that's the group of kids that are coming all the way through, and it's indicative. It helps us predict the next 12 years much more carefully. And this year and last year, the kindergarten projections were much higher than the actual number of kindergarten students we had. Now, it's hard to know how much of that was COVID, how much it's going to change in the next few years. Did people move more or less than they used to? Some of that is still to be determined. But the elementary projection came in 34 students below the projection and 36 below at kindergarten, right? So I'll say it again, this year's kindergarten has 36 fewer kids than the projection a year ago. And all of K-6 is 34 below, so really it was all kindergarten. Junior high was right on target. High school came in with 20 fewer kids than the projection, and we'll talk a little bit about Minuteman, but we have had more kids going from 8th grade to 9th grade going to Minuteman, so that's part of that. So all in all, we have 53 fewer kids than the projection, and we also have 53-ish fewer kids than a year ago. Next slide. So this is sort of the history of kindergarten, and it's closely tied to the economy, it's closely tied to housing sales, turnovers, moving, mobility, all those things. And so for FY17 and FY18, the projections, we had 40 to 55 more kids than the projection. Then it was 16, then it started coming in with much fewer kids than the projection. So 40 fewer in FY20, 51 fewer in FY21. We know what those 2 years were like in terms of COVID and kids. And now last year, the projection for FY22, the original projection was 372. That was like the fall the year before. They redid it in the spring, and it got a lot closer, but we had already done our registration, so we kind of knew how many we had. So we actually had 312. I'm going back a year longer, but in FY23, so the current year, 298 kids, and the projection had been 334. And now the budget year that we're doing right now, for next year, the projection is 338. So what I look at is really the actual over a period of time. And if I go back just 4 years, we were at 302, 279, 312, 298. We base this budget on 300 to 310 kids. The projection was 338. We're targeting really 310, 300 to 310. We've been shrinking classrooms to make that work appropriately. And so back when we had 340 or 50 kindergartners, we had 17 or 18 classrooms across the district. This year we have 16. Next year we're planning for 15. So we're shrinking classrooms based on the actual number of kids we get. We're in the registration process right now. It closes at the end of March. We think we're on target to be in that 300 to 310 range. So that's just kind of a little bit of the history of the number of kids coming into kindergarten, and then that flows pretty consistently through the district after that. All right. And then these will be pretty quick, but this is the K-12 enrollment. It goes from 2005 to 2030. Enrollment, if you went back 30 years before that, it's cyclical, and it goes up and down over a number of years. If you look at it, it's really been relatively flat since 2019, and then the projection going forward is relatively flat, maybe going up a little bit. Dave will talk a little bit later about how that impacts our budget. This is just elementary, and definitely the drop at elementary has taken place, and again, we're relatively flat. Minuteman, there's the numbers at Minuteman of students from Acton attending Minuteman has gone up quite a bit, very in line with when their new building opened. And so Acton had consistently had 30 to 35 kids per year, per grade at Minuteman. And now, not per grade, 30 to 35 total, so 9 or 10 kids per grade. Now it's more like 25 kids per grade from Acton, all right? So these are total numbers. So we went from 36 to 59 to 78, and this year we have 83. And we expect probably one more year of jump, maybe two. And the assessment is based on a 4-year rolling average of the previous 4 years. Okay? Boxborough, I think, as you know, withdrew from Minuteman. There were 4 to 7 kids total from Boxborough. And this year, there are none. And then the totals are down at the bottom. And the towns are each responsible for the assessment and transportation for the kids from their town. We have had historically a program in our school where staff members who are hired by Minuteman teach a program at our junior high school. In this budget, we have moved that program from a Minuteman program to an AB program. And so that the money that was being paid to Minuteman directly from the district for the program, we've reallocated that money from an assessment to the district from Minuteman to our budget to pay salaries and curriculum supplies and materials to keep that program in-house. So we basically moved that program in-house. Next slide. This is the junior high enrollment. Junior high looks a little more up and down because it's really only a 2-year school. And we had a bubble for a couple of years, and now it's going back down. If you did it in a straight line, you'd see we're getting closer to the bottom of the drop. And then the high school, it's still got some dropping to go, so you can sort of see where they are. And then the next few slides are about class size. I want to point out the scale here. It looks a little dramatic. The scale is from 20 students to 24 students. So our class sizes have gotten smaller. This goes from FY10 to FY22. And so the elementary K-6 classes averaged 23 and a half, and last year they averaged 21 and a quarter, something like that. So we've dropped about 2 kids per class. We used to be the number 2 highest class sizes in the whole state, and now we're right around the middle. Junior high, again, it looks like a big blip, but that's just because it was 1 or 2 years growth. So 21, it went up to 24 for a couple of years, but it's right just below 21. And these are averages of averages of averages, so don't take them too. There was a much more in-depth report in the December 1st school committee packet. And then the high school, similarly, average across the academic departments has gone from 22 to right around 20. And there's definitely a lot more variation there. The multilingual multilingual learners, or formerly you might have seen them as EL students, English language students, has definitely grown rapidly. And this was part of a presentation. We had our coordinator of multilingual learning with us that night. But basically, the red boxes, I think, are October 1 numbers, 279 in 2019, 273, 256. As of November of this year, we were at 343. So we're at 7% of our student body are multilingual learners.
Marie,
And
can I just jump in?
Yep,
We're
go ahead.
actually at 346 now, and
Okay.
just enrolled 3 more students.
okay,
So they're in the registration process but haven't started school yet.
thanks.
So we're at 349.
And where do we go to high incidence? Is it like 350? Because, do you know? It's below that. What, do you want to say more? Because,
Deb, do you have the high incidence number? I mean, it was somewhere in the low 300s,
Yeah,
I
it's
think.
350, so
350,
we're
okay.
there.
Yeah, yeah. So we will move into the high incidence
Can
this
you
school year.
explain what high incidence means?
It means that the state gives you a title that you think carries money, but it doesn't. We asked, we said, wow, we're going to become a high incidence district. That must mean that we get money for this. And they said, oh, no, it actually doesn't. Unless we somehow break through hold harmless status, and in which case then it could start to benefit us.
and it's wonderful for the diversity of our student body and the families that are moving to our towns and our community, and has really added a lot to our schools.
Can I just say one thing? So what's interesting to me, and I saw this today for the first time and just fell out of my chair, the jump from August to November. When we talk about Chapter 70 aid and the impact on that, I don't think you'll even see this because that's based on the October 1 enrollment. So where in between the two blue bars, the October 1 count was taken is where it'll show up in the foundation budget numbers.
Just one more comment on this too. I think, I think during the pandemic, we all know immigration slowed a little bit. So I think that's why you start to see a little bit of that dip in 2020 and 2021 and into, possibly even the beginning of this year. But the other thing that I think we're seeing a little bit of is a shift in terms of where our students are coming from. And we're seeing an increase in students coming from countries that during the pandemic did not offer educational services. And so typically if students move in and they have had broken education, there's a categorization for that. During the pandemic, they stopped using any categorizations because everyone had some broken educational services. But in particular, we are seeing a real rise in the number of students who are coming in where their schools had entirely shut down for 2 years. And, the government may have, mailed out a packet of things to do or sent videos to watch, things like that, but really did not have consistent schooling over a couple of years. So that's something that I think educators in classrooms are also having to really think about is, in addition to students who may not have English as a primary language, what happens when a student also maybe has not been enrolled consistently in school for 1 or 2 years during the pandemic. So that's when we talk about that rapidly shifting need in students, that's certainly, impactful in that thinking.
No, all good. And so we're going to talk a bit about staffing, and then we can take some more questions. So this next slide, I think most of you are familiar with this, but we essentially have 6 employee groups, about 1,100 employees. 3 of our employee groups are collective bargaining units or unions, and the other 3 are non-union. So ABEA, the Acton-Boxborough Education Association, is our teachers union. Within that group, we have teachers, counselors, nurses, curriculum, coaches, specialists, et cetera. There are just over 500 staff members that are part of the ABEA or in positions that are in the ABEA. We have two much smaller unions. ABOSA is our Office Support Association. There are 34 positions in ABOSA. And AFSCME is our Custodial and Maintenance Unit, and there are 39 positions that make up AFSCME. Support staff is our sort of second biggest category of employees. We have almost 300. Many of those are part-time, some of them are full-time. They include part-time classroom assistants, special education assistants, some of them are part-time, some of them are full-time, our cafeteria workers, et cetera. Talk a little bit about hiring before we move on from this slide, but there's a group of salaried staff and administrators. There are 86 positions. It's all the sort of support functions, if you will. So our tech support, our finance department, our human resources department, our special education, some of our special education staff, principal, central office, office managers, et cetera. Those are combined 86 folks in non-union positions. And then our bus drivers, our transportation department has 42 positions. Hiring has changed a lot, and I think you're all seeing it no matter what you do. We have not been able to keep substitutes, to keep many of our hourly staff and some of our certified positions, particularly in special education. So special education assistants, special educators, English language educators are hard to staff. And then what happens particularly with substitutes and part-time assistants and part-time staff, if we don't have those positions filled, if anybody's out sick, then we're pulling people from places to cover other places. So I think if you talk to anyone in our schools, there's definitely a big impact of that. We're looking at our structures for substitutes in particular, and to see if there's more we can do to hire and retain. Do you want to add anything to that, Peter?
No, I think that's a summary. I think we're going to have to really think as a district about wages for those traditional salaried positions in order to be able to be competitive with the communities around us. I know our substitute rates are sometimes, $25 to $30 less per day than communities around us, and so subs have left our district in order to be able to go earn more in surrounding towns. But whenever we don't have a substitute in a school, that then pulls other staff members out from their primary jobs. So you might have a math specialist who had planned a lesson with a classroom teacher in a third grade classroom, who now all of a sudden that morning has to cancel on the third grade teacher because they're now covering a kindergarten class or covering a sixth grade class. And vice versa, that's happening a lot with our specialists, coaches. Special educators are having to cover for each other in order to provide services during the day. So they're missing lunch prep, things like that. That is proving really challenging, I think, for educators. So the staffing shortage is real and it's having an impact. And, it's the crux of it seems to be, from what we've seen over the last 2 years, substitutes, assistants, cafeteria workers, extended day staff, same thing. So we're looking at some strategies to try and make those positions more attractive to people moving into the next school year.
Thank you. Okay. So our 3 union contracts all expire this June 30th. 3-year contracts all on the same cycle and time frame. We have been negotiating with our teachers, the Acton-Boxborough Education Association. We started the pre-work for that last spring and through the summer. And we've been actively at the table negotiating since October. We have a tentative agreement, and we should be able to bring that to you in March. It still needs to be ratified by the teachers, so we can't talk about it publicly yet. What I can tell you is that it fits within the budget that we are presenting and that we have been presenting. So you'll hear more about that in March. And we will be negotiating with AFSCME and ABOSA starting in March, and we'll get those done by June. All right, so this is a high-level summary of the proposed salary budget. So the far right column is, the two right columns is the, I'm going to say it wrong, FY24 budget versus FY23 budget, dollars and then percents. So if the total salaries are $68 million, about 2/3 of the whole budget for all salaries. The teachers are up 2.6%, and 45 million is the total for the teachers' salary teaching column. So it's up 2.6%. That does reflect the cuts we're making. So Peter's going to go through the cuts. He talked about the total number of cuts. He's going to go through them a little more specifically. But the teaching budget is up 2.6%. The central administration budget, that's really central office, is down 17%. You'll see why when he goes through the cuts. And everything else is sort of a function of either things moving from grants or support staff is up 7.5%. We did have, like we said, special education assistants have been hard to hire. We've had more kids move in, and so we have had to add special ed assistants this fall, this winter, and so that's part of that increase, and there's a little bit moving back and forth between grants that's in that increase. But overall, salaries are up 3.1%, and the biggest percentage of that is teachers, which is up 2.6% after cuts. These are all after cuts. All right, next slide. It's back to Peter.
So we'll talk a little bit about our overall approach to balancing the budget and then get into more detail. First thing we looked at doing was thinking about a smaller, more efficient district office. And when I say the first thing we did, that actually dated back to last summer, last July, when our director of operations took a different job. We actually elected not to fill that position, instead piloting, a trial of merging finance and operations. After going through the year, I've decided to continue to keep those two positions merged. So we also have looked for other opportunities to restructure, and I'll talk about, a little bit about what else we're doing at the district office, but that was certainly on our mind. We also looked for other kind of non-personnel budget savings, but those of you that have followed the budget over the last several years know that personnel makes up the vast majority of the school district budget. And so, unfortunately, when there are big numbers that need reduction, we are unavoidably talking about personnel. And then when we did have to look at personnel reductions, we tried to minimize the impact on students and their school-based staff to the greatest extent possible. If you recall, last year, we had looked first at non-certified staff when we had to reduce. We cannot take that same strategy this year because operationally, we need to maintain the level of non-certified staff in order to provide, lunch and recess coverage, other types of supervision around schools. So we're really locked in on the non-certified staff at the level we have to be at. And so this year, it's really looking at administration and certified staff in terms of what we're reducing in the budget. So just to recap, and I'm going to talk about this, Dave was going to talk about it again, but we just want to make sure we're clear about what we did. The final budget appropriation for the current fiscal year was just shy of $103 million. We knew that the level service budget was about 107. We knew that we had to identify programs and services provided by grants that had to come into the budget, which we had used some pandemic funding to be able to continue to offer. We looked at revenue adjustments on Dave's end in the finance department, and we're able to look at about $200,000 of revenue adjustments during the process. We then looked at just shy of $1 million in non-personnel budget adjustments, and then we still had about $1.8 million of staff reductions that we had to look at over the course of the budget process. Another way of looking at that, at a different level of detail, so, you know, Dave looked at about $190,000 between different forms of state aid and other revenue adjustments that he just honed in on. Investments changed a little bit through the process because of inflation. We're at a higher investment rate than we had been at previously. It was little things like that that they just continued to refine the model. So you see benefits and insurance, choice charter assessments were also adjusted. Special education costs, we had to originally estimate as high as 14% as we went student to student through the district, which is something that Dave Verdolino and Jen Truslow do. They go through every out-of-district student that we carry, figure out which students might age out in the next fiscal year and who we might be considering right now that could need a potential out-of-district placement, and then they create a budget based on actual students in the district. When they did that, that brought the special education budget down about $625,000. We then reduced 5% from everyone's instructional budgets. 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but with high levels of inflation, 5% can be tremendously impactful on an operating budget. And then looked at shifting some of the cost of utilities out of the district's budget into the food service program. So the food services are now carrying more of the cost of the utilities that they would use. Food services has been a shining light over the last year because the state has been providing free meals. So when you see revolving accounts, and Dave presents that in a few minutes, you'll see why we chose to shift out of the district's operating budget into food services. So that got us down to about $1.8 million, in which case we had to now start thinking about personnel. We are proposing the addition of 2 staff members, a reduction of 17.4 equivalents of staff members for a net change of going down 15 staff members, 15.4 staff members specifically. The proposed additions are 2 English language educators. We just had a program review from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. In order to just provide the required minutes, we will have to add 2 English language educators. As they're called in DESE, we call them multi-language educators. But we have to do that. It's entirely possible if we continue to see enrollment rise, we may have to find a way to add a 3rd. I was just talking to our coordinator today, and it's certainly something we're thinking about, but right now, based on numbers, we're looking at 2. In terms of reductions, I'll talk about the process for that, but essentially we looked at opportunities to reduce through attrition first, because we are dealing with real people who have had careers at Acton-Boxborough, and so if there was an opportunity that someone either retired or resigned or moving on, we tried to think hard whether or not we needed to hire that position back, and that was our first look at reductions. So we were able to reduce 9 of those positions through attrition. That still left 8 more and change that had to be reduced through actual budget reductions. So the overall reductions are 17.4, and again, we go up to English language educators, which is why the net reduction is 15.4 educators. By level, I thought it would be helpful to just understand how we looked. In terms of district-wide administration plus some support positions for leadership, that was 6.2 of the overall positions. At the elementary level, there were 2 positions, junior high 3.6 and high school 5.6. Those of you who have been watching this for a long time will know that every year we watch elementary enrollment very, very carefully, and typically adjust classrooms on an annual basis based on elementary enrollment. We had not gone through that same extensive exercise at some of our secondary schools. We went classroom by classroom this year through the junior high and high school enrollment, and the principals had to work with their staff and leadership at their schools to be able to do that, which is why you see larger reductions at the junior and senior high than you see in the elementary school. That's just how we did that balancing exercise, but it was really with the idea that we wanted to maintain appropriate class sizes at all levels of instruction and not have wild shifts in any one level or any one school. So as we thought about this, we really categorized priority levels in terms of reduction. One, obviously, I mentioned was attrition and opportunities to just not rehire a position that someone was leaving. We then looked at district-wide leadership and any other administrative efficiencies that we could find. We then took a hard look at class sizes, and then we still had to continue to make some reductions. And we tried to avoid things that would be either more impactful to students by either increasing class size, having to move students around the district, or having to look at programming that was reduced. Like, we didn't want to cut into a music or an art program or, not offer something to kids. That was one of the things we tried to avoid at all costs. In this category 1, these are the positions that we were able to reduce through attrition. I already talked, you heard earlier, Dave Verdolino and Marie are retiring this year. With Marie's retirement, we have just appointed Andrew to take the place of Marie as the deputy superintendent effective July 1. With that, we are not rehiring the position of Director of Special Projects, so that reduces one central office position there. He has been doing a lot of work around communications. He's been mentoring new principals for us. He's been doing a lot of support for human resources during the pandemic. Just a lot of kind of the, I think of him a lot as the free safety. If you play football and think of that analogy, someone who can really do a lot of different jobs, we're going to lose that position. So we're going to have to think a lot about what that means in transition. Director of Operations, I mentioned before, that was vacant, and we've left it vacant this year. In addition, we recognized last summer that we had lower kindergarten enrollment than was originally anticipated, so we just didn't hire one of our kindergarten positions, even though it was budgeted. Similar with the high school social studies position, we ended up with a vacancy last summer that was unanticipated. We chose not to fill it then, knowing that we would likely have a challenging budget. Same thing, a special ed assistant at the high school was in the same position. A junior high campus monitor was also vacant. Last year, we had a retirement of our district-wide digital literacy coordinator. We chose not to hire it then because, again, we knew the budget would be challenging looking forward, and we wanted to give that some thought, but we've decided not to fund that position in the following budget. There was a high school science position that came up as a retirement, and then we had vacancies for both the district-wide PE director and an art director that we didn't fill this year. We've been stipending out some of those roles to educators in the district, so we're going to continue to do that next year. And so all of these represent positions that are reduced in the budget, but don't represent individuals who are currently employed who won't be. I just want to be clear about that. In terms of district-wide administration and leadership, the items listed that are grayed out represent items that were already reduced through attrition, so they were on the previous slide. But in addition to that, we reduced an administrative assistant in the high school counseling department. We also reduced a part-time registrar at the junior high, and then 2 district-wide curriculum coordinators, which is a pretty significant reduction for us as well. We looked there because they were not in classrooms every day, and we wanted to preserve, to the greatest extent possible, the staff who were in schools and classrooms with students. Looking at class size was the next category of reductions that we had to make. So again, 2 came through attrition at the high school and elementary level. But then we also looked at reducing a high school English position, another elementary kindergarten position. So our sections would go from 17 2 years ago to 16, then to 15. a junior high school world language teacher as well, and then part-time physical education and art teachers that are at the high school this year. These were the teaching portions of what had been our K-12 directors for those two departments. This slide represents some additional things that we found to be very impactful. We wanted to avoid this slide at all costs. Items in yellow were originally listed with school committee as potential reductions. Those have come back into the budget. So if you see something highlighted in yellow, it means it has since been restored into the budget. So what I'll talk about is we're still going to have to reduce a high school, junior high PE health teacher. This is going to lead to some very large class sizes. It's going to also impact our ability to offer health curriculum at the junior high and to be able to make changes that we need to when the state releases its new health education frameworks next year. So we are concerned about that reduction. Similarly, at the high school, there's an individual who is a part-time senior seminar coordinator that we're not going to be able to carry that. We'll still offer senior seminar. It's going to have to look a little bit different at the high school next year in terms of how that's offered. We were able to restore the library media positions in the schools that were there. We also were able to restore the high school TV studio manager. We know that was an important position, not only from a program standpoint, but also the individual in that position served some of our students with significant disabilities in the school, and so that was important to us to be able to restore. We also were able to restore one of our first grade positions at the elementary level. If you recall, the concern we had about this is if we had to do that, that would have actually required us moving students around the district during their elementary experience. That was a last resort. We're glad that we were able to restore that. And then similarly, we were able to restore a high school counseling position. And I think for all the reasons we've already talked about supporting students' mental health and social emotional well-being, we thought that that was an incredibly important position to maintain. So of this, most of these positions have been restored. There are two positions still that we were not able to bring back in this budget. So just to summarize again, overall, it goes down 17.4 FTE, but with the two additional English language educators, so we're down 15.4, and again, the summary by level. Just want to recap a few big points, and then we're going to pause for questions. One, I just want to stress the continued increase in both the volume and complexity of student needs that our educators are seeing. That's associated with post-pandemic learning and some of the gaps that grew as a result of the pandemic. Some of our multilingual students' needs and increasing numbers of students there with higher needs, as well as students with IEPs and the services they need. Students with IEPs were significantly disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and there's a real need to make sure that we protect the services provided to students with disabilities. Overall, we're down 36 full-time equivalent positions over a 2-year span. Last year was 20.6, mostly non-certified, and this year it was 15.4, mostly certified. The dollar value, interestingly, of those reductions is about the same. But you can see, once you start reducing certified positions, the dollar value, increases really rapidly because salaries are obviously different. We do just have to keep, making sure everyone understands that, if we continue to have to reduce at this level, you saw what we were able to kind of restore to the budget as, as we had some unanticipated leaves this year toward the end of the process. But if we were to have to cut those, we're really talking about some significant impact on kids. And so this year, we're going to have an impact on kids because we're going to be growing class sizes. We're going to have some other programs and services that we can't necessarily provide. But if we do this again, it's going to be even more challenging because I think it will be felt more in classrooms. So I just want to make sure I say that and keep repeating that message. So we can.
Can I just add one little bit to what you just talked about? We listed them as positions that were vacant, positions that were reductions, and so on and so forth. I just want to emphasize that just because they were vacant doesn't mean it didn't have a huge impact on kids or a school or what we're delivering there. Some of them are affecting class size, some are affecting what we're going to be able to do. You know, of 5 or 6 top central office administrators, 2 is a big cut. In the curriculum world, we're losing a lot, a real lot. When we talk about the director of performing arts and the director, not performing arts, no, director of visual arts and director of PE and health, I mean, Deb could talk more about it, but we're losing curriculum, we're losing pre-K to 12 vision, we're losing hiring and supervision, a lot of things. I don't know that those cuts are going to be fully sustainable for the long term, but we did what we had to do. And yeah, student needs are high and higher than they've been. So, you know, we're looking for both long-term sustainability and affordability and long-term being able to meet kids' needs. So it's all a balance.
So I'm going to take questions from the committee. I'll just say we're going to try to keep it to 15 minutes, so if we can be efficient with language, I'd appreciate it. Hi, Tessa.
I thought that the curriculum coordinator that we were losing was science, but that says 2.
There's 2 curriculum coordinator positions that we're reducing. One is literacy social studies. We have 2 literacy social studies curriculum coordinators. One of those positions, as well as the science coordinator position.
I don't think I was aware of the literacy one. Have we talked about that
Yeah.
before? We did? Okay.
Hi, thank you for the thorough presentation, Peter. I know I am on the budget subcommittee, so I've kind of been able to watch all of this as it unfolds and, you know, really looking under the couch cushions kind of thing for trying to find the additional funds. I just want to reconfirm that, you know, with us receiving basically the minimum aid from the state and having costs increase that we had no control over, such as healthcare, and having, you know, the levy limit where we can't, you know, we're basically at the mercy of the taxpayers and what they're willing to put into the school budget. That's kind of, you know, the perfect storm of why this has become so tight, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to our top 10 list that of the challenges. There's really a confluence of a lot of different challenges that came forward this year. A lot related to kind of the current state of the economy, a lot related to, you know, with inflation. Certainly kind of the history of the levy limit in Acton and taxing in its maximum capacity put a hard cap on what we were able to generate in terms of assessment revenue. But then there were other pressures as well, you know, post-pandemic pressures, you know, grant funding expiring, things like that, that all kind of played into this. So, you know, it's no one item that really tipped the scales for us. It was more the confluence of all of it. But Dave, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Just one tidbit. So one of the top 10 items was the 14% increase in tuition that OSD allowed. 5% of which was inflation and 9% was, excuse me, an unprecedented increase that ostensibly was to allow them to attract staff from districts like AP. To special ed tuition, private school tuition, and for students with IEPs that we send them to for significant tuition costs. And the other thing, the additional 9% was for, as I understand it, was to cushion them from the funding cliff of the COVID monies that they had received for the previous years. So this district needs to pay that tuition rate to those schools to send our kids there next year at those rates, partially because they needed to offset the funding cliff, and yet it rebounds to us and adds to our funding cliff. We've got over $1 million ourselves, no relief from that, and on top of it, we have to subsidize private schools for the same thing. The silver lining, as I look at it, will be in the following year when, out of the box, we won't have to build in $1.2 million of previously grant-funded expenditures. I guess I should say you won't have to, but the district won't have to right off the top as a fixed cost, say, well, we need to carry forward these services, that cliff has bottomed out, if you will, in FY '24.
And just to piggyback on what Dave said, it's not about the fact that the community is funding out-of-district tuitions. It's that the state has raised the cost of those so exponentially in the year, but isn't coming forward with the funding to help the district, right? And so, really, there's still opportunity, I think, for advocacy at the state level around some of that challenge in particular, and we should take every opportunity we can because, if the state is going to place that financial liability on districts, they should also be prepared to come with the revenue support.
Looking forward, when do we expect to be out of hold harmless again? Do we have any idea? I was hoping it was like 3 years or some sort of projection.
I'm going to talk about it, but I'll give you a real quick answer because this is the complete answer. I don't know. I'll talk about it in a little bit.
So I just want to reiterate, and I think this is the fourth or fifth time we've looked at this, and that it is not sustainable. It's not sustainable to our students. It's not sustainable to our educators. It has been extremely challenging, I know, and for all of our educators to deal with this, and with a couple of years in a row, giving them so much more to do with fewer resources is just absolutely tragic. It makes me deeply uncomfortable. I don't think that, I think that we take our school system for granted at our peril, and we need to figure out a solution. And I also just want to say that with regard to all of these budget cuts, I think it's really, really important that we somehow continue to expand and improve our identification of special needs at the earliest possible opportunity, and start remediating those, which ends up costing less money. And so I don't think that we've specifically talked about how the budget cuts impact that process of identification and remediation in the pre-K and early grades, but it's something that I think is really a huge issue that we can't that we can't afford to not think carefully about, to the extent that any of these reductions impact services and educators at that level, especially now that the assistants, a lot of the assistants are gone. So that's all I'll say.
All right. Thank you for a great presentation. One thing I noted is we talked about a 17.7% reduction in central office staff. And then you went on to say that our central office staff would become more efficient. And I think it's disingenuous to say that by cutting that many people that we are going to become more efficient. I think, in fact, we're going to become less efficient. And while it's really important to save as much as we can for those employees who are directly servicing our students, I worry that those things that may not be urgent but are really important are not going to get done. You talked about losing a director of special projects. We've combined a director of facilities in with a director of finance, which I think these are all the hard choices that we have to make, and those areas are going to be covered. But I am concerned what will happen from a sustainability standpoint of the forward thinking, processing new curriculum that we know is coming out, all of those things that we typically look to our central office staff to support. So, again, I applaud us putting as much as we can towards those people who are serving our students directly, but I think as we move forward, we should be very honest with ourselves and with everybody else that a 17.7% reduction in central office staff is going to be far from more efficient. We're going to have less services in the central office. We're going to have less that we're going to be able to get done, and so I think we just need to be very, very upfront about that. So that's my comment. And then my quick question. And you know, I think we don't need a deep answer on this, but we looked at kindergarten numbers that swing wildly. We've budgeted our kindergarten classrooms pretty tightly for this year. What happens if we get 30 extra kids for kindergarten next year? How does that affect our budget?
Of course, I looked at Marie, and she gave me the look of saying that won't be my problem. No, I think, you know, we've always committed, like, if we end up having to add a kindergarten educator, we're going to have to come back and tell you we had to add a kindergarten educator, which means then we're going to have to look at other areas of the budget that are going to have to get shifted around to do that. It's similar to, you know, if we had to add, you know, $300,000 worth of special education assistance this year, we have students who require the services, we're going to provide the services. It just means you have to look at other aspects of the budget that then have to be reduced as you go through the year.
Now I'll speak for myself, but thank you. Thank you, Adam, for the question. You know, the answer is we will or you will deal with it. But the March 31st is the end of kindergarten registration. We will have a number at that point. We think we're tracking within that range I gave you, the 300 to the 310. If at that point it looks higher, we'll come back to the committee and talk about it, and you'll have to make another difficult choice of one thing versus another thing. It's a couple of things that are happening make it hard to look at historical data. So a lot of people are moving into town in the summer, in the fall. And that's always been the case. I have, 15 years of data of how many kids moved in between April 1st and October 1st. But if it changes, we're going to have to deal with it. And one of the things that was really hard looking at making budget cuts is, could we have cut a first grade? Hard to know, but if we did, we'd have to move kids around. So if you start, you got to start right at kindergarten, or you're adding a classroom later on, or you're trying to move kids, neither of which is easy to do. So I know you all know all that, but Andrew and Peter and Sheri will do a wonderful job.
Okay, so now I had time to absorb what the answer to my question was before, so I just want to say that I think that in our community and amongst many parents, it's really easy to get caught up in some of the changes that are forward-facing students. But what makes this district great, or what has made this district great, is high-quality curriculum. And the areas where we are cutting directors or coordinators or whatever you want to call them are the things that make kids want to be at school. So science, gym, art. And I understand that we had to make those choices, but my kids have gone through these schools, and gym at the high school is like a disaster. I mean, in junior high too, it's like so many kids all at the same time. And, unfortunately, that's something that does make lots of kids want to be at school, and we're reducing a teacher or part-time teacher and a coordinator that organizes everything across the district. I just think that these aren't student-facing positions necessarily, but they are what make things doable for educators. Teaching science is hard. It changes all the time. The things, the standards and what kids are expected to learn and the high-stakes testing and all of that is hard. And it's hard for educators, especially at the elementary level when the focus is on teaching math and literacy most of the time. I hope that the 5 people that take over the positions on school committee for next year recognize what a loss this is. And I understand that we had to make these kind of cuts. I'm not suggesting that I would have made different cuts. I agree with the budget and what's been presented, but it's really easy to dismiss things that aren't seen. And this is a lot of behind the scenes work, and teachers see it, and this is going to make the educators in our district's job much harder. So that's just my comment.
Anyone in the audience? Hey, Christine. We are on time, and I'm feeling really good about it. I know, I did. And I'm Southern too. I'm gonna knock on this one.
Am I on?
I should've known
Ooh.
better. Yep.
All right, Christine Russell, Acton Finance Committee. Quick question about your slide on multilingual learners. So the slide showed an increase of over 110 students between August and November. Did we get 110 new students after school started, or did we just not know in August that they were going to be language learners?
Those were new students.
So after school started, they moved into the district?
Yeah, we're continuing to have students move in. Not every country in the world has the same school year that we do. And so oftentimes if people are coming from, countries that have a different school year, they don't anticipate when our school calendar might start, and so they might register after the start of our school year. So it flows along a different calendar.
Okay, so with our total enrollments being what they are we just seeing more people come in from out of country and less from the U.S.? If we brought in 110 students, at least more, I assume, during the school year.
Peter, can I just jump in a little bit? So I think it was from August until November. And when we enroll kids in the summer, we're not necessarily screening them in the summer. So I actually think a lot of the students came in, say, August 1st or later.
Okay.
And certainly the way that the rules around immigration worked the last 2 or 3 years, we had more of an uptick in a shorter period of time. It's just hard to know what's going to happen over time. The best I can tell from the numbers is from a year or a year and a half ago, we went from 5% of our students being multilingual to 7%. So.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Good Sir Peterson.
John Peterson, 6 Jackson Drive. I've said this before, but I'll repeat it, and I think Adam really already has said this. I think that incorporating the facilities position into operations can be okay, but we still need someone with the talent and the time to focus on facilities, and I think it's a false economy not to spend the money there. There's too much money that flows through supporting 1 million square feet that position can't, in a certain sense, pay for itself. And then the other thing, I know that Kyra wanted me to say a few words about turnbacks, so.
I really did jinx myself.
Exactly, and I think this question about what would happen if we needed to add a kindergarten section or something else happened, we had more students move in. These things happen every year. What if interest rates go up and Dave makes too much money on his cash float? There are a lot of pushes and pulls. So although we use the term budget, I hope that everybody, looks at the budget number, that high number, as this is what we are planning to appropriate. This is not really what we're planning to spend because we expect to have a turnback, and that turnback typically would be in the range of about $1 million. So we're going to spend about 99% of the appropriation. So a little event, which would be $100,000, $150,000, is well within the ability of the plan that you're voting on to address. It would be foolish to have a plan that said, we're spending every dollar we're appropriating. It would not be survivable. So nobody should think that we have that inelasticity in the budget.
Appropriations, turnbacks, and fungibility. We did learn our lessons, Mr. Peterson, I promise. We paid attention. Hi, Evan.
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation and the well-thought budget. So I have two quick questions. One is kind of some probably Peter or Marie, you can help me to understand how the Minuteman is going to impact our budget. Basically, say, just give me an example. If one student, say junior high student, goes to Minuteman, how much budget pressure do we get?
So Minuteman doesn't directly impact our budget, but it indirectly impacts our budget. Minuteman assesses the town of Acton for every student that enrolls at Minuteman. It doesn't directly assess the district. However, for every dollar of assessment that, in the town's overall budget is comprised of municipal costs, district costs, and Minuteman costs as three very large buckets. So for every dollar that one entity appropriates or assesses to Acton, it means that the overall pool of money to the other entities is reduced. And so we know that, if Minuteman, and I don't know their exact per pupil expenditure, I believe it's somewhere in the $40,000 range. If a student goes to Minuteman as opposed to the district, that's a cost to the town of $40,000 on the assessment as opposed to the $17,000 per pupil that we're doing plus state aid and everything else. So it's just the overall pool of money is reduced to what's available to either the municipal, town, or district budget. And there's finance committee people here who probably could articulate that better than I can, but I got the thumbs up, so thank you.
Well, okay, so then the follow-up question is, so from the table, actually, so in FY23, junior high enrollment is down by 20, right? So, but Minuteman enrollment increased from 78 to 83. That's only 5 increase. So is there any reason to explain we are losing 20?
So the overall, what you're looking at, the junior high is not the place you want to look for Minuteman impact. It's actually 9th grade. Because students leave the district after 8th grade to go to Minuteman as their high school. So you wouldn't see anything in the junior high enrollment. The total number of 83 students is grades 9 through 12. So that's over 4 years. So what we're talking about is an increase from roughly 8 students a year or 9 students a year going to Minuteman up to 20 students a year. So we're seeing, 15 fewer students go from 8th to 9th grade to the high school.
All right, I'm ready to move on. We ready to move on? Let's keep it moving. Mr. Verdolino.
Okay. Yeah, of course.
We do get a break after this section, everyone.
Okay, thank you. This presentation is going to try and stay at a high level. Some of the slides that you'll see, you've already seen Peter present, and so I won't beat them up too badly on top of that. In the budget binder, this section is the subject of one of 2 memos that I wrote, and so presumably you have or will have a chance to have read that to get a more in-depth look at what our budget consists of. Really quickly reviewing where the budget planning took place. We knew we had limited state aid. Again, our minimum aid is $30 a student in the budget process. Reserves are declining. They're still healthy, but we know that we're trying to make an effort to reduce reliance on reserves. The funding cliff we just talked about a few minutes ago required us to put a lot of costs that had been covered by grants back into the operating budget, and we've talked about the Acton tax levy issue. So when everything was added up, the available new revenue, not counting assessments, was about $450,000, while at the same time the final budget reduces E&D and capital reserves by $275,000. And so the amount of additional funding that can go toward the budget was $181,000, or about 1% of the prior year. And so recalling, if you can stay at this for a second, I wrote Adam's lesson. If you're the school committee members, there'll be a quiz on this at some point during the year. When revenue growth doesn't keep pace with budget growth, with the anticipated budget growth, the difference is supplied by the assessment. And so That's why we're looking at a budget increase of 2.77% and an assessment increase of a little over 3% total, split between the two towns. So just a couple of comments about some slides that I've presented in the past. State aid revenue is increasing, but not that greatly. We're not benefiting, the district is not benefiting from the Student Opportunity Act, at least not yet. There's hope. I'm so looking forward to seeing the new numbers to try and project where that might come in, but as yet, we've not seen anything. And the comment at the bottom is why minimal growth is significant. This is 97% of total non-assessment revenues. So the district is funded from assessments, from state aid, and from other sources. The state aid piece is about 20% of the total, and it's the lion's share of what doesn't come in from assessments. And so if it's not going up by very much, that means that it needs to be made up by the assessments. So I've shown the next slide too before, and the key thing here is the line that's shaded in yellow. Look how the percent of the budget funded by revenues is shrinking. It continues to decline pretty steadily throughout the period presented. Over a 5-year period of time, Chapter 70 has increased by all of $455,000. That's from FY20 through estimated in FY24. Only a 3% growth in that period of time. All the other revenue sources are up by $600,000, or 26%, but the other sources are a lot smaller as a proportion, and so that's why it's not having as great an impact on the budget as a significant in Chapter 70 aid would. We looked at this slide before. I'll say that I put in quotes the second one. We will need to target 3% as an increase. That was from the January 12th presentation, and we beat it. We ended up at a 2.84 assessment increase to Acton. The comment can't sustain the assessment without more than 2.5% plus new growth. That's obvious. It's absent an override by the town. In my opinion, that's still several years out. It was not considered, to my knowledge, by anybody in a forum that I participated in this year. But it's clear that the direction, the trajectory of the budget compared to other revenue sources is not one that favors ignoring the likelihood of an override at some point. So,
Dave, can I just pause you on that? Can you just talk a little bit about the extra use of E&D and why the assessment changed in the last week or so?
Oh, so that's true. We've not updated, we've not spent a lot of time talking about the fact that in the final analysis, to make the Acton number fundable, excuse me one second. Sorry, thank you. We increased the use of E&D reserve by $1.25 million, which was in the preliminary budget, to $1,375,000. It happens, I think this is coincidence more than anything else, to be the midpoint between what we came out with in the preliminary budget, $1.25 million, and the amount that was used in the FY23 budget, which is $1.5 million. Notably, it's still a small decrease in the use of E&D reserve in 24 from 23. But as a result, the preliminary budget said that the Acton assessment increase would be 2.99. It's now down to 2.84. Okay? So that's a quick summary of revenues. If we look at expenses, again, Peter went through all this, but in the planning stage, We estimated that certain of our fixed costs would be rising at 5% or more. You can see the list, I won't read through them. Salaries, typically, we've experienced steps and lanes costing about a 2.5% increase on budget. The COLA increase was to be determined because negotiations were in process. When we added everything up, including the need to restore the former grant costs into the budget and the need to provide additional English language support into next year's budget, we were at about 5.7 million increase, or 5.6%, which we knew, nobody here ever saw that being presented because we knew that had no chance of being seriously considered. So that's where we were at the outset. Peter has looked at the next two slides, so I'm not going to go over them, but just to reiterate, this was the process. We came from level services. We had finite things that we needed to add, and then we had a $2.8 million gap in order to close to where we needed to be in the budget. And so this was, in summary, the process that we did, and Peter went through in more detail, so I'll leave it at that. So in the final analysis, when the budget amount of $105.8 million is what's being proposed, this is reproduced from the budget binder. It's way easier to read in the binder than it is on the screen, especially from 58 feet or so as I am now. But I'll tell you that the four lines shaded in green represent 96% of the total increase in the FY24 budget. So four categories: personnel, no surprise; health insurance premium, rates went up 8%. Because of attrition and position cuts, the budget impact is only 5%. So that was a bit of a silver line, unanticipated silver lining there. Middlesex County Retirement System assessment and OPEB trust contribution round out the increases from 23 to 24 that are virtually all of the net increase in the budget. Sorry. You've seen this before. What's noteworthy is, from my view, as John said before, we turn back about $1.25 million. This represents a little bit more than my 6 years with the district, and the average has been $1.25 million, and we hit the average on the dot last year. It's not by design. I will say that I think in good faith, we honestly do think we're going to spend what we budget, but circumstances change, and there are ways to economize during the year. And so I will say, too, that it isn't the case that we plan to spend 99% of whatever is budgeted, taking advantage of how easy the math is when the budget is about $100 million. There's two sides to the turnback, and one is the revenue side. And in FY23, whatever turnback that you will see will be largely driven by revenue surplus and not by budget savings. And so when you look at it that way, 20 million or so of non-assessment revenues, because the assessments come in dollar for dollar. So 20 million or so of revenues and 100 million or so of expenses. It's from that $120 million combined pot that you get the turnback at the end of the year. So the preliminary assessment, it's based on the prior 3 years' enrollment. If you look at Acton's enrollment, you can see a trend where it's decreased each of the last 3 years on October 1st from the preceding year. And Boxborough was down 20 students in 21 students in 21. And lo and behold, up 47 students in October 1, 2022. That's what's driving the shift in the allocation, which was 84.02 Acton to 83.71 Acton. And 84.02 was this year, 83.71% next year, and the corresponding change for Boxborough. And the October 2022 numbers, where Acton is down significantly and Boxborough is up significantly, is only factored 1/3 in the FY24 assessments. It's a 3-year average, so another 2/3 of that change will be manifested in the upcoming 2 years assessments. A couple more slides from now, I'll show you a quick look at that. You've seen this. This is a visual of the trend. This goes out to FY27. When I first came here, Acton's assessment share was on the upswing, and it's crested, turned around, leveled off a bit, and the last couple of years, as you see, has declined pretty substantially in the mirror image to Boxborough. And the next one, I looked at the NESDEC numbers, which Marie gave you a bit of a caveat about the NESDEC numbers, but between the two towns, I feel they're an objective basis to do a projection like this. And so just looking at their K through 12 projections for the next 4 years, you can see, you can see that Boxborough's percentage of the total is going to approach 20%. And that's from 15.5% just a decade earlier. So quite a sizable shift in the cost allocation between the two communities. And as I say at the bottom, in FY24 dollars, each 1/10 of a percentage is $86,000 on the assessment. So it's a significant amount. And another way to look at it, potentially, there was some back and forth about the impact of the Minuteman enrollment on Acton. Well, a student that goes to Minuteman is going to reduce Acton's share of the Acton-Boxborough allocation. And conversely, Boxborough isn't sending students, maybe unfortunately so, to Minuteman anymore. But enrollment in this day and age in school funding, students represent dollars in the ability of whatever organization is involved to fund their operation. Two final bits here. One is I summarized all the major revolving funds of the district, and I don't have totals here because it's a fruit salad, if you will, but you can clearly see that where in FY21, COVID-related problems, financial problems, caused us to really dissipate fund balances in a number of these programs. And in FY22, they're largely back. For community ed, it's on the heels of a significant ARPA award from the town of Acton. For the school lunch program, it's because the federal government extended the free meal waiver for FY22. For FY23, the state did the same thing, at least until March 31st. We're told that the governor is trying to seek funding to continue that waiver through the end of this year. And I just heard recently that they're thinking about putting in their budget. I will be very disappointed if it doesn't happen because they're talking about it publicly, that they may extend the free meal waiver for FY24. That would be a significant benefit to the district, but more importantly to the families who now will be able to not have to worry about finding the money to send their kids to school and know that they won't go hungry. So the bottom line to this is, I think it's safe to say we've generally recovered from the pandemic levels in our revolving funds. Third time's the charm. So this one, my last slide, it's shaded FY23 because these were last year's numbers. Apologize for the irregularity of the columns. The new governor is afforded 6 extra weeks to file their initial budget. We expect it by the first week of March. It's possible it would be out the week before that. Once it's out, I'll have a more detailed analysis than just the 6 numbers on this spreadsheet. I do expect hold harmless to come down. If you look, excuse me, from 22 to 23, it came down by $1.7 million. It came down about almost 40% from the prior year. That number needs to get to 0 before we get foundation aid. So the foundation aid, which is right under A minus B, it's the foundation budget less the district's required contribution, is foundation aid. That went up 15% last year, but we didn't get $1,683,000 of representing that 15%. We got $303,000. It should have been $30 a student. The governor made it $60 a student, I think, in reflection upon the prior year where we got 0 because of the pandemic. But had we been a foundation district, Acton-Boxborough would have gotten $1.6 million more Chapter 70 aid. Think about that for a second in FY23. It is something that's still out there. There are still 4 more years of Student Opportunity Act out there. Inflation is probably going to be at 4.5% in the upcoming budget. That's what I've heard. That drives a lot of it. The district's contribution is not necessarily just a 3.5% increase. There are penalties, there's a cap, there are other things to it, which is why I need, Rebecca, the time to just analyze the proposal when it comes out. But I'm really looking forward to it. So that's a summary of the budget. So questions now on either the material I covered or the material in the budget binder?
And can I just clarify one thing I said earlier, if you don't mind, before we take more questions? So when I was talking about the numbers of students at Minuteman, I was doing some combined numbers, and the separate by town numbers are a little bit different. So Acton students currently at Minuteman, there are 20 ninth graders, 29 10th graders, 23 11th graders, and 11 12th graders. Boxborough students currently at Minuteman, there are 2 students at Minuteman who live in Boxborough. According to our numbers, we don't get the assessments that go to the separate towns, that kind of thing. So what I was trying to say is, on average, students from Acton-Boxborough 8th graders going into 9th grade used to be about 9 per year on average. Now it's on average 25 per year, but that's an average. That is separate from, for Yebin's question around the drop, the enrollment shift, junior high, high school, 8th grade, 9th grade. There are all kinds of ins and outs there. It's not all just Minuteman. I was just saying that going from what used to be an average of 9 8th graders going into 9th grade to now 25, that alone is a jump of 8th graders to 9th graders leaving the district, if you will. But then there are all other kinds of ways that students move in, students move out, all that. So I was trying to generalize, and I think some things got conflated. So anyway, that's sort of the Minuteman thing.
Hi, Adam.
I'm going to continue to pull on this Minuteman string for a second. And my first caveat is Minuteman is a great program, and it's perfect for those kids who are going there. So I don't want to discount the quality of the program that's there. However, any student from Acton-Boxborough who leaves our district to go to Minuteman hits us in 3 ways. First, the town of Acton receives an assessment that is significantly higher per student than the assessment they would get from Acton-Boxborough. Secondly, Acton-Boxborough, in our current incarnation, we lose a whopping $30 per kid in state minimum aid. But hey, $30 is $30. And then third, to not leave the town of Boxborough out, a student from Acton who leaves the district eventually makes the proportion of students from Acton lower, and therefore the proportion of students from Boxborough higher, and therefore the assessment to Boxborough increases. Now, we take all of that and we combine with my comment from before, where, hey, we have a more efficient central office staff. Guess which staff we would look to help us create a program in our own district that would help keep kids engaged and excited about going to ABRHS as opposed to moving to Minuteman. So, we know we're in a really tough position. I think we have to just be very honest with ourselves about where we're cutting, what we want to be adding, what the goal will be, and what an expense around a curriculum coordinator or someone in the central office staff may have to support us in the long term around keeping students in the district, keeping kids in the enrollment here, helping us get to hold harmless faster, helping us balance out the real balance of students in the two towns versus who's enrolled here, and helping keep the budget in Acton at a reasonable level. That's my comment. That was me pulling the Minuteman thread for a sec. And again, it's a great program. I have nothing against the program or the building or any of that. It's just something that we as a district who are responsible for the education of our students in the town and the budgets of our town need to be aware of.
We can hold multiple truths, y'all. Multiple truths. More. Hi, Evan.
Just a quick question to Dave. So in the budget, you list a few items about the key fixed cost increase, right? That's 5%, right? If you can remember. So one of them is, the last one is the utility increase. So but there's no number. I was wondering what the percentage of increase do you consider in the budget?
We initially came up with 5%, and I don't think we changed it. We didn't have a basis to change it. So that's in there at a 5% increase going
The
forward.
utility.
Utilities.
But that's reasonable?
Short answer, yes. We are fighting, first of all, natural gas costs are very low right now. Supply and demand has made it so. We are looking at savings. Kate Crosby, our energy manager, has brought to light some opportunities for additional rebate type things because of how green our energy sourcing is. So I think I'm comfortable with it. I certainly wouldn't say, well, my electric bill went up 25%, so I think I'm going to raise the district's budget by 25%. We're in much better shape because of the groundwork that's been set in this district than, I'll speak for myself, than my house.
Anything from the audience, y'all? Do we get to take a break? We all set?
Come back at 8.
Yeah, we're going to adjourn. Not adjourn, I'm sorry. I am sorry. Freudian. That was Freudian. We're going to take a recess. Come back at 8, y'all. Thank you so much. So believe it or not, y'all, it's 8:02. I'm so glad we're greeting our neighbors and enjoying ourselves. This is that time, again, to tell your punchline, finish your gossip, take one last bite of cookie. Because by the time I get rid of this plate and come back and sit in this chair, I'm going to reconvene us. Okay, y'all. We are rocking and rolling. Everybody's good? Everybody with us? I know. We're almost there. We're like over halfway through. And there's no executive session tonight. Everything is awesome. So we could just like refocus. We're gonna get there. Okay, here we go. So, district benchmarking in comparable communities. That's you, Peter. Ready, go.
All right, so welcome back, everyone. I will congratulate you because you're actually more than about 2/3 of the way through this. We front-loaded a lot of the heavy information in the first presentation and second presentation. The next two, I don't think will nearly be as quite heavy of a lift to try and take on all the information. What's that? Yeah. No, one of the things that I've tried to do since I came to AB was annually just put up some data around how districts in our comparable communities spend money by broad categories. We take the comparable communities out of the comparable communities report that was done a number of years ago. So we don't just randomly pick which towns we choose to compare ourselves to. This was a study that was done jointly by the district and the town, and to identify other comparable districts. So what you see here for other communities is not random, it's out of that report. I will also put a real caveat on this. Some of the numbers you see can be influenced by how districts report finances. There's a lot of nuance to how districts categorize expenses across a large budget. And if there's variation between districts, that can skew some of the numbers. So I just want to put that caveat on there. This is not perfect. It's just more of a general barometer to say, all right, how are we spending money at AB? What are our priorities? What are other districts' priorities? And what do we want to keep in mind as we think of our budget every year? All of this information is available publicly on the Department of Education's website. If you go to the URL, and all of this information is in the packet, you can access this. You can create your own list of comparable communities. So if you don't like the ones that I'm presenting tonight and want to, create a new list, feel free. It will update with whatever information you want. And it's just, again, a nice way to dive into how people spend money. And if you want, you think we use a lot of acronyms, I would challenge you to go to Desi's list of acronyms over here on the right. I think there's a bingo game that goes along with it. So the other thing I'll mention is sometimes this data is lagging, like English language students or multilingual learners that we mentioned before. The data will tend to lag on radar because they will take a snapshot in a moment in time, whereas we try to provide the most up-to-date information. So just know that sometimes the numbers might be a little bit off. That's normal and it's to be expected. You can see, obviously, our enrollment decline. We have had a decline in percentage of students with disabilities in the district over the last couple of years. That's something we'll want to look at, I think, as time goes on. The percent English language learners obviously doesn't reflect the data that you saw tonight. I would also venture that some of the data around students with disabilities may not reflect what we've seen over the course of this year, because we have seen a number of students who are in the evaluation process across the district. And then you can see that data trend around economically disadvantaged students and families. That is in here. I skipped a lot of these slides. These, to me, are the ones, especially, for our finance people who love this meeting, are kind of the most interesting slides. It is the spending of comparable communities by major category of spending for the district. So right now, what you see is the per pupil expenditure of all of the comparable communities. And so we are the median of our comparable communities list at 17,794. At the low end, Wachusett and Westford are down there, and just a little bit higher is Weston. Although Sheri has told us we should not expect that out of her. But you can see Weston is around $30,000 a student. What should give us all pause? If we spent $1,000 more per student, and we have 5,000 students, Dave, how much money would that be? $5 million, all right, on our own budget at $1,000 more per student. If we spent $13,000 more per student, that would be a fantasy. But in all seriousness, the opportunities that come when you see the dollars from per pupil expenditure, those need to be compounded by the number of students that we serve as we think of this. So it means one thing, that we're state average, that's reasonable, we're at the average, and we're in the median of the communities, but there are opportunities either gained or lost as people move through this spectrum of communities.
Can I, just one quick observation, because, sorry, Sheri, and other alums, we crack wise about Weston's position here, but Weston's a much smaller district. We do have better economies of scale. And so what's interesting is you look at Wachusett, which is the biggest regional district in the state, and they were at the bottom. And you could say, well, Wachusett doesn't support its kids. They have greater economies of scale than anybody else on the list. So the piece that when I look at something like this, I want to say, well, how big is the district before I make a value judgment? If you put Provincetown up there, Provincetown might be one or two of the ones above Weston, and it's because they have, 27 kids.
Thanks, Dave. I guess I can't pick on Weston anymore.
We were having fun.
In terms of administration, you can kind of see the overall pattern here is that whatever the median community is in the list has the blue box around, and then Acton-Boxborough is always highlighted in yellow, just so you get a sense of where we fall. So in administration, we fall just below Wachusett and above Reading on this list. In terms of instructional leadership, we are actually above the median right now, but keep in mind, the budget that we're proposing significantly reduces that. So I would anticipate in another year or two, we'll see ourselves drop below median here. Spending on teachers, again, we're now below median. I think I didn't get an opportunity to go back a couple of years and look at that, but this is certainly something that we want to watch with what we're doing. Other teaching services, we are trying desperately to figure out with DESE exactly what goes into this. It's one of those categories they list that then they don't align with their acronyms, and so it's a little bit complicated. We believe that this is, what, Dave?
Teacher assistants.
Teacher assistants? I'm not sure if that's the case, but we're trying to work on that, and if we get an answer at some point, we will get that out to you. Professional development, Acton-Boxborough is, relatively low. The piece that I would point to here, and Dave and I looked at the other day, is if you look from Westford at the bottom of the list to Acton-Boxborough, there's a $50 gap per pupil. If you look from Acton-Boxborough up to, Wellesley or Dedham or Weston, there's a $350 difference per pupil. So the amount of money that we're able to spend on professional development is, this is an important area for us to pay attention to. Instructional materials, we're just about at the median. Not a lot to say about that. Guidance and psychology, we are the median. This is an area, I think personally, I would like to see us be a little bit above the median in terms of the support that we offer kids, but we're right about in the middle of our group. Pupil services, this is an area that we're above the median. Operations and maintenance, we're below the median. This is an also area, as Dave mentioned, that when you start to get into economies of scale, it can show up in operations and maintenance in particular, because you can have some more efficiencies the larger you are. And then benefits and fixed costs. So overall, we're just about in the middle of those comparable communities, which, you know, I think at some point over the next couple of years, it would be interesting to talk about what the list of comparable communities is, because I'm not sure this is our comp anymore. I think our demographics have changed significantly, that it would be probably an opportune time to start updating this list of who we want to benchmark with. But this is what we have now, it's what we've historically presented, and I wanted to just be consistent with data. I told you this would go faster, so any questions in terms of comp communities?
I don't know what they, because I haven't looked at the website, what information they provide, but do we have any sense of what percentage of each town's budget their schools utilize, and whether or not they've had to do any budget cuts, or what their revenues look like, or is that all?
No, DESE doesn't collect the town data on, you know, percent of budgets for schools. You know, I know anecdotally there have been some finance directors around the state who have looked at kind of what are your initial budget proposals being presented as, and initial budget proposals are typically level service proposals, and I'm going to guess that we're seeing a lot of districts up in the 4 and 5% increase range to maintain level services. Is that about what you're seeing? Or even higher?
More, and I also don't necessarily buy that it's just level services, and there are some districts, probably less so now than many years ago, that would just come out and say, we need 16 more teachers, and we need this and this and that, and they come out with their wish list budget as their preliminary budget, and knowing that there were cuts to make. And I say that only because to try and track that, you're really not necessarily getting a consistent picture, because when we presented the numbers here about our budget progression, we never presented the level service budget. We never presented the level service budget with the add-backs and the grants and the EL teachers. We never presented the worst case scenario and to put it out there for shock and awe value or whatever. We knew where we needed to come in and presented a realistic budget from the get-go. I don't know, I have seen on the listserv something to that effect, that budgets were in the 6, 7, 8% range, some of them, not all.
The reason I ask is just because I think we're sort of talking about in general how this is like an unsustainable model for funding, and I'm just wondering how other communities are looking at it and, you know, being impacted by that thought.
You mean the percentage of budget growth year to year? So there is in the budget binder something that looks like this. You'll know it's got a yellow stripe across it where Acton-Boxborough is found. And this is a 5-year average of the same comparable communities, their average budget growth for those 5 years. And we are, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth from the bottom at 3.0% average growth for the last 5 years. Belmont tops the list at 7%, Hingham 6.5%. There's not a big range. The next jump up is like in the 3.5 range, and 3.5 versus 3 on average over 5 years is significant. If we were to add 0.5% to our budget next year, great. We're really sitting pretty. And so we're in the very low range of our comparable communities as far as budget growth.
Just a point on that. I'm part of as part of the Massachusetts Superintendents Association, we have regional roundtables, and I'm part of the Tri-County Roundtable, which is one of the largest roundtables in the state. It covers all of basically Norfolk and Middlesex counties, and even a couple communities in Worcester County that are kind of bordering us. We're actually doing a legislative breakfast that's being held, I believe, the week after vacation, where it's all of the superintendents, and then we've invited all of the legislators to come together to hear presentations from superintendents about the various challenges that they're all seeing as part of this budget process. So that as they go through their budget process at the state, we can create some advocacy around, additional state aid. But, we're not alone in this challenge this year, but, we're the ones that have to deal with the impact.
An observation and a comment. So the observation is around the operations and maintenance line. The list that we're looking at here is a mix between regional districts and municipal districts, and we know that the municipalities often roll those operation costs into the municipality. So I think we have to, take that with a grain of salt. And then the other thing in terms of, Peter, you mentioned maybe reevaluating the comparable districts. And I think one of the things, if we're doing that, we should decide for what we are comparing against, because I don't see some of our neighboring districts in here where we may not consider ourselves comparable in some areas, but if we think about some of our challenges around recruitment, if someone's willing to drive to Acton, they're probably willing to drive to Concord. And so maybe looking, putting together a list of comparable communities, not just from a spending or educational outcome or finance point of view, but also what are we trying to compare against? What are we trying to resolve? What are some of the challenges in our district?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'll be very transparent. I believe Concord, Carlisle, Lincoln, and Lincoln-Sudbury, and possibly Sudbury, are all part of this comp community study. I omit them because the structures of those regions are so wildly different from ours that their cost centers fluctuate significantly, and there's just no basis for comparison. We do compare our salaries, certainly, as we need to be competitive in different areas with all of those communities because it is who we draw from. But if we put it up here, you're going to see the numbers go all over the place to such a degree that it isn't useful information.
So I then might just challenge you, what is useful about comparing comparable communities? What are we looking to compare here?
I think if we say that we're at the bottom of the list in operations and maintenance, it draws some questions for a subsequent budget as to, all right, why are we bottom of the list? What aren't we doing that another community might be? Is there something we want to explore, reach out to the community, find out what they're funding, what they're not funding? Similarly, if we find that we are wildly high in a budget category, and we're saying, geez, we wouldn't have thought of that, I think it can lead to some really productive questions about why. It doesn't mean that you're forming judgments based on preliminary data, but from a benchmarking standpoint, it's a sense of, are we spending money in similar ways to our peers? If not, there might be something that we choose to, vastly outspend our peer communities in on purpose because we think it's going to be the secret sauce of Acton-Boxborough, right? But it may not be that as well. So it's more of just a checks and balances to what we do.
Hi, Steve. I think it's on. No, it's not.
Hello? It's on. So Steve Newton, Acton Finance Committee, and I was on that committee. Maybe the last one standing that was on that committee, but I would echo Peter's comments about the devil is in the details. We spent a lot of time calling other school districts and towns trying to figure out where they put what costs in their DESI data. I would never ever look at benefits and fixed costs. It's a mismatch from town to town. We didn't even look at all the columns on that. And the purpose was exactly what Peter just said. It was a fishing expedition. How do we compare to a bunch of other towns to see if there was something that we could find that we were grossly overspending in some area? I will tell you, Peter, you can probably rest assured on the teacher number because it's an average per pupil, and what I found, because I was one of the ones digging into that data, that it was more a reflection on how old your teachers were than anything else, because they tend to move up with steps and lanes. And as I recall, that was what we found out on that. But by all means, it was a while ago, so feel free to do it again, but don't ask me.
Yeah, and, Steve, what I didn't show were some of the slides that the other basis of comparison, instead of just total dollars spent by category, they actually have, full-time equivalent employees per 100 students as a basis of comparison as well, so you can kind of balance the two.
And yeah, as far as Concord, Carlisle, Lincoln, Sudbury, it was the complications of the way they were structured and their costs and where they classified things. It wasn't worth trying to dig into.
Dave, you're up.
Thank you again. So in the budget binder, you'll also find the second of my two memos, and that'll be about operations and capital for this year and capital planning going forward. Obviously, FY23 was a challenge with JD's departure. The focus has been mostly on the CIP program, as well as putting out some fires, not literal ones, but emergency situations that have come up that required immediate attention from the Facilities and Maintenance Department. And so, again, in the planning phase, the goals, if you will, for the capital budget for FY24 was to maintain the current level. We are including $1.5 million in next year's budget for capital if you include the debt service on year 4, imagine that, of the CIP bond, and $700,000 of new appropriation for capital projects. I wrote in my notes, we resisted the pressure to make cuts to the capital budget in the exercise that Peter discussed before, but to my knowledge, it was actually not considered or not seriously considered. We understood that the district was underspending on capital for many years through a lot of effort and planning and foresight, put together the capital plan, and we took a year off, as I'll explain in a minute. We didn't want to go backwards, so we maintained the CIP plan for spending on capital projects in FY24. The note from a prior presentation was to convene the capital subcommittee, and I see that this did not have my late addition. We actually met on February 13th, and there will be more meetings to come of the capital subcommittee. And the other goal was to maintain a flexible approach to future capital planning because of, I'll explain in a minute what Bureau Veritas is, but to look at their recommendations. We're also going to be meeting shortly as administration to consider organizational changes that might be warranted for next year, when you'll have a new director of finance and operations, a new director of facilities as our interim person is leaving, and just how the organization could be structured or could be structured differently going forward. So the next slide talks about the CIP plan, a quick summary. The plan was developed in FY19 and the bond was issued in FY20. So FY24 will be the 4th year of debt service. It's a 13-year plan. In the first 3 years of the plan, we completed $8 million worth of projects out of $23 million in total that were identified. We did not appropriate any capital in FY21, the COVID year, but we're back up to $700,000 in the FY24 budget, and the plan calls for increases annually of $100,000 through FY30, that being the year that the CIP debt has been retired. What did we do in FY23? As I said, we had some unanticipated emergencies. Is there such a thing as an anticipated emergency? And completed them. Bureau Veritas, it was anticipated in the CIP plan that we would revisit the plan in its entirety and look at all of the projects that were listed, reprioritize to the extent necessary, find things that had been overlooked, erase things that were no longer required. And that company that was hired is called Bureau Veritas. They are they're just about completing their field work. We spoke on the phone with them yesterday, and they are anticipating a report to be issued in about a month from now. And also in FY23, we identified some priority needs that were not on the CIP plan, and I'll refresh those in a minute. And what's next is beginning to develop a plan for how to proceed going forward to encapsulate everything that we've just talked about, and that's a work in process. As I said, the capital subcommittee just met this week. The current status of the plan, is there a slide before this one? Can we go ahead one then? That one. Thank you. The CIP and facilities, as I said, are currently being reevaluated. We talked to them yesterday. They are very detailed, and their report is going to be very thorough. Anticipated needs, which you'll see in the next slide, are based on a combination of projects that were identified in the original plan, plus some other things that have come to light that were not anticipated. Everything that you're going to see next is currently being evaluated for both scope and realistic cost estimates. So I think you need to go back. Thank you. So this list of 6 projects is one that I've presented to school committee and budget subcommittee and capital subcommittee. And so I won't go through them, but you will note that the first 2 items are in red, and that is because we are looking to prioritize finishing those as early as this coming summer. And I'll go into details in a second. And the other ones are still to be addressed, but it's a daunting task to find that amount of money if you add up all the numbers in the right-hand column. My initial plan, as I presented, was to repurpose savings in the Boardwalk Campus project. We can't do that legally. I got an opinion from DOR that said, no, you can't do that. You need to go back to town meeting. You need to go back to the voters to exempt it. It's February. We're looking to put town meeting warrants together. It was just considered too rushed a process to do it, especially since the number 1 and 2 items on that list are the least expensive, but the most urgent of all 6. So now I think we can go to the next one. I think we have to go back. There's one that says funding of immediate needs. I may have to call an audible here. This may not have made the final cut. So the 2 items in red, we can leave it here. The 2 items in red, the compliant telephone system, we have a budget estimate. Brendan has obtained that, and $450,000 is a good number. We're confident in that number that it can be done for that cost, and that work can begin during the summer of 2023. $450,000 also includes a contingency, so we're good to go on that. And the Conant ceiling, the next one down, that $600,000 number was an engineer's estimate for phasing in that project over 5 years. That means hazmat crews mobilizing and demobilizing 5 times. We have put an invitation for bids. We published an invitation for bids. General bids are due March 8th. We met yesterday for a pre-bid meeting on site. There were 3 contractors who showed up. That showing up from where they came from expressed interest. We should get bids that should be competitive. And within a couple of weeks, we should have the ability to move forward with a number significantly less than that. That's what we're being told is there's a lot of mobilization, demobilization costs built into a 5-year phased project, not to mention inflation that we may avoid.
One thing I would add, just thinking about Conant, because I think it's been a topic of conversation with Capital Sub and School Committee over the years, because we've continued to submit statements of interest for Conant. So the question arose, is it worth putting a capital investment into Conant at this time? I think is a logical question. To me, the answer is yes, because A, we need to remove this material, and 2, even if we didn't remove it now and had Conant as part of a larger project, it's still going to have to be removed using the same process that we would use now. So you're keeping, kids and faculty safe and doing something that's going to happen whether or not you have a major project.
So I think we leave it on this slide and we'll talk about, so the $1 million or so identified for the first 2 projects, we have that funding remaining in the CIP revolving fund. And so we have the wherewithal to do those right away. And if it happens to be during the summer, we could, to the extent necessary, use next year's capital appropriation as well. But I don't think, based on the numbers here and the anticipated bid results, that we'll need it. We can and should proceed with those 2 projects. So what about the remaining ones, the 2 roofs and the 2 HVAC systems? There could be others in the Bureau Veritas report that we don't know. I'm not seeing anything from our preliminary discussion that's a budget buster. We will have to identify existing and outside resources. And by resources, we've got some arrows in the quiver here. We have the CIP fund balance. We have money in the capital stabilization fund. We have our annual budget appropriations, $700,000 next year, increasing $100,000 a year for the next few years, subject to appropriation and budget capacity. There's an electrification grant that I explained to school committee when we discussed this earlier, that will greatly reduce the cost to replace the rooftop units. The costs that you see here, unfortunately, are not before the rebates, they're after the rebates. But we're talking nearly $1 million grant to fully electrify the mechanical systems at both buildings, which is a good thing for energy policy. It's also a good thing cost-wise. The consultants have told, the cost gurus who have looked at this and done the life cycle cost analysis, expect us to save considerable amount of money over the life of these units when they're installed. And a geothermal grant that's available through the Boardwalk Campus Design is another, until very recently, unanticipated source of potential funding, and that's through the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the federal government last year. And lastly, as far as how to fund it, considering whether a bond issue is needed for cash flow, whether it's desirable in the big picture as to how to fund capital versus operating budget, and then in conjunction with the capital subcommittee, I expect to coordinate all of the information I've talked about, I'd say on items 1 through 4, but you can't see them, they're on my piece of paper. But what I just told you about the process, the projects, the Bureau Veritas report, the various funding sources, coordinate the timing and the funding of all of those projects, and essentially rewrite and update, but rewrite the CIP plan going forward from year 4 onward. Do we have capacity? Yes. If we look at the debt that comes off the books, You'll note the scale starts at 3 million, so don't be fooled that we're almost debt-free. The Boardwalk campus debt is roughly $4 million through FY '50. That's the news. The good news is it's at a net interest rate of 2.15%. But there is capacity. You'll see the red bars means that next year the town of Acton is freed of the Parker Damon building capital debt. After FY '25, the district is free of the junior high and senior high debt, and all that substantially remains at that point is the Boardwalk campus debt. Last reminder, and I think this is the last comment, yep, and I'm really happy to say that I've said to school committee that we had the financial advisor estimate the savings from our decision to bond in March of 2020 versus the conventional short-term borrow bond at the end of the project, and they came up with a figure of $33 million is what we saved the taxpayers of the two communities by that decision. Well, that estimate needs to be updated because that was a few months ago, and interest rates have risen since then, and we would not, under the conventional funding, we would not have issued the bonds yet. And so the clock is still running on how much we've saved the taxpayers just by that decision, and we'll probably continue. I'll continue to remind you. I think it's important when we look at the other capital needs of the district. And are these unplanned? Yeah, maybe some of them. Are they going to cost money? Of course. But to some extent, we're playing with a bit of house money here. That's my view of it. And this is the slide that I finished after Julie put it in the packet. I've been busted. Sheri, I've set the bar awfully low for you. I think so. There we go. That's what I just kind of said. Yep. And so here you know. So this was my. It was.
It's all good. Just stop talking.
Yeah. I'll miss you too, Marie.
Getting punchy, y'all. We're having fun here. It's good. It's good. Hi, everybody. Who's got questions?
Dave, quick question. Which grants are you looking at for electrification in particular?
I don't know the name of it off the top of my head. It's in a detailed cost summary. It's the high school grant was $900,000 on a $3.4 million cost, but I don't recall the specifics of it. It could possibly be the same IRA source.
For the heat source pumps? Or is that something?
The heat pumps is the IRA, that's the Boardwalk campus.
Gotcha.
All right, quick.
Unless she asks my question, then it's not all right.
Then we're all set. It's unlikely. Quick question. Now that the preschool program is no longer in this building, this is the one that needs the $900,000 roof, can you just give me a quick, brief rundown of who and what uses this building besides obviously these meetings?
So one of the things the district has done over the last 6-7 years has been to substantially build out a number of in-district special education programs that have allowed us to keep kids in district who might have otherwise been, kids that had to go outside the district to receive their education. From a financial standpoint, it's actually one of the lone bright spots of our budget over the last couple of years in terms of out-of-district tuition savings, but it also allows kids to stay here. A lot of those programs have required more space to be able to function, and so we've been gradually bringing more of our departments here over the last, year to year and a half. We're going to continue to do that. We've brought our curriculum department out of the junior high, which has allowed more space for some junior high programming for students. We are moving our facilities department over shortly to improve communication now that it's going to have to be more streamlined. We also know that at some point the modular outside the junior high is just, it's old and it's not going to function. So we have to prepare for that usage. We don't have capacity within the district in our buildings to move all of our central office. We also have wanted to get some space at our high school for some different types of STEAM labs, talking about kind of the Minuteman conundrum of why are kids leaving the district for programming. We want to start building out some programming in district for kids, but we need more space to do that at the high school. So we want to bring our technology department over in the next year or so. So this really will need to be the hub kind of district function, or some other building, but to go lease a space of comparable proportion is not really feasible.
Okay, so the goal is to sort of stretch out the usability of this facility for as
I think we're going to need
long as we can. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
we don't have any other solution on our horizon.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Good, sir, Martin.
Thank you. Dave, those electrification rebates, do they sunset at some point? Is there timing that we have to consider for those projects?
If there's a sunset, it's far enough in the distance. These are very new, Dave, and we're going to engage a consultant to just be proactive about it. And not to mention, there might be more other than the two that I just mentioned. I talked with our energy manager today about it, and we don't know what we don't know. I mean, that was a very generous bill that was passed last year, a lot of money involved in it, and we are expecting to get a consultant who's fluent in that world and just find things that we qualify for.
But it doesn't have to be done like in 2 years or something like that?
In fact, the Boardwalk campus, it's already been done. And so this would be a credit for something that we already did and thought was a good idea without any knowledge of a credit.
Yeah, I was just thinking the reverse of the timing for those capital projects. Do some of those need to come first just because of the timing of those grants? Anyway, thank you.
Yep.
If I were to put on my energy hat for a moment, I do know that the Department of Energy has grid grants, which is part of the whole resiliency program. Those literally just kicked off this year and go for 5 years. So there's a 5-year period of time where you can apply for funding, and then it goes out for several years thereafter until you complete the project.
We've looked at a number of different funding mechanisms that we might employ over the next year or so. One of the ones we've discussed recently is, using the $700,000 appropriation that we have now for capital in the budget. We could always actually choose to go out for another bond within the operating budget that doesn't require a debt exclusion, and potentially use that $700,000 appropriation to repay, or at least a portion of it to repay some type of shorter-term bond as well. What we didn't want to do, where all of this is very, very new, was rush the process of vetting these projects well and then fund things that maybe really didn't need to be as high a priority as we thought. So I think given the timing of when we're finding out about the opportunities and, budgets need to be in for town warrants and things like that, I think what we wanted to do was take care of the highest priority projects in the next fiscal year, but then study the next tier of projects a little bit more. It could be that we, if the town were holding a special town meeting like in the fall, we could always do something then, but more likely 1 year from now is when we bring some of these projects to fruition, I think.
Although it's true that the big bucks were in the bonding, and that was a spectacular accomplishment financially, I also want to thank everybody who worked on the Boardwalk campus, some people who are in the room, many people who are not, all of whom collaborated to bring that project in, under the appropriated budget, and that's really, it's a tribute to everyone, all the people who worked on the committee as well as the architectural lead and the contractors. It's fantastic. So that, $3 million win should be celebrated tonight. Then I also want to respond to Peter's comment about future bonding. There's been a lot of discussion about the financial constraints in Acton and what they do to the appropriated school budget. I think it is important to look at future capital activities, at the scale of the HVAC things, and ask the question of, if these are capital projects and they are long-term assets, should they really be inside the operating budget or should they be debt excluded? So when that subject does come up next year or the year after, I hope you'll keep that in mind.
Hi, y'all. Hello. Thank you for an excellent presentation, team. We need to have a discussion, and then I'm accepting motions for a vote. Are there any other questions or comments about any of the presentations that we've seen this evening? They were quite comprehensive. Okay. Any lingering questions or comments from our, hi.
Sorry. Multitasking. I have one comment, which is a note of gratitude and appreciation, not just to the administration for putting together a really well thought out, prepared budget over the course of this period, but also to the members from both towns, leadership, communities, FinComs, select boards. We came together early this year to really discuss the conundrum that we were going to be in, knowing that it was going to be a tough year. And it's been really great. From what I've been hearing about the process on the Acton side, about getting to close the gap that we had. And I just wanted to express my gratitude to both towns. I know I spoke with the FinCom from Boxborough as well, who saw this budget presentation last week, who had really high remarks for some of the programs that we're putting in place this year and continuing on for next year. So I just wanted to say both thank you to the administration for putting together a great budget in a difficult year, but also with the support from the leadership from the two towns, because I think we knew it was going to be a tough year, and there was, while it wasn't easy, it was relatively smooth for the difficult year that it was going to be. So thank you to everyone for that.
Thank you, Adam. I would echo that. I think, we've tried to approach this budget with a real level of transparency for everyone. And I think one of the things, for as challenging as the budget was, having known the scope of the challenge at the outset of the budget allowed us to, we tried to put a lot of effort in communicating with staff, making sure people knew what we were doing. I think it allowed us to, work with our administrative team to give a lot of thought to what we were proposing as budget reductions, and not feel like we had to go week to week in terms of looking at what the target might evolve to be. And that allowed us on our end to kind of do the things that needed to be done. I will also just, give a shout out to our staff because, the last few years have been really challenging. And, I think from a morale standpoint, going through 2 consecutive years of budget reductions, even in a period of declining enrollment, we know that sometimes you have to reduce staff based on enrollment. That's reasonable. But that's still really hard to go through that process when you feel like you're already struggling to meet the needs of kids in your classroom. So, just real, shout out to the staff for the professionalism that they approach their jobs with each day, even under hard circumstances. So just want to acknowledge that as well.
I'm cool with holy silence, but I think somebody needs to make me a motion.
I move to approve the preliminary budget as presented.
Hold on.
Do the good language this time.
Sorry.
It's a very fancy
We gotta
piece
do the
of
good
paper.
language this time.
I found it. I was gonna say, I'm gonna give this one to Adam, actually.
All right. I'd like,
Okay, so I just want to make sure, Beth just put up a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's on the bottom. Just flip it over.
The band. Okay, so you gotta read it verbatim. Ready, go.
I'd like to make a motion that the total budget for the Acton-Boxborough Regional School District for the fiscal year July 1st, 2023 through June 30th, 2024 be preliminarily set at $105,747,586, an increase of 2.77%, and that the budget, or excuse me, strike that, and that budget would be funded by member towns to be preliminarily assessed in accordance with the education reform law and the terms of the regional agreement and the amendments thereto as follows. Acton, $71,669,758, an increase of 2.84%, and Boxborough, $13,944,299, an increase of 5.18%, offset by use of E&D reserve in the amount of $1,375,000. I think I said that right. With the remainder account for other sources of revenues and reserves to be detailed in the final budget vote.
Ben, Tessa. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any further, any opposed, any abstentions? Then that passes unanimously. Congratulations. Very good, everyone. Well, that was an achievement. It deserved that applause. That deserved that. That was quite an achievement. Thank you so much for all of the collaborative work. Okay, so then, Peter, is there anything you would like to highlight before we adjourn?
I would just note that the election calendars are included as well in the packet for this meeting. So other than that, just want to say thank you for all of the work on the budget. I know it's a long process. We come back March 2nd, obviously, for the budget hearing, and then March 16th is the final budget vote. So thank you.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
We're going to give that to Adam and to Tessa. All those in favor? All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.